So without further ado, introducing Sir Raf. Hi, Sir Raf.
Hi, good afternoon. Narinig niyo ba ako? Okay naman yung mic?
Yep. Clear naman.
Alright.
All clear.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. Welcome ano yung tawag yun? Skills Brewing. Tama. um, so, yun, salamat sa introduction. Again, my name is Raphael Alampay. Uh, so, okay, maganda naman yung turnout. No? This is my second time dito sa Skills Brewing. The last time was yun nga, yung sa machine learning, artificial intelligence using Excel. No? So you can check out that video. Thank you pala kay Gab and Illustrados for inviting me over again. I do enjoy yung mga talks na to. Pamparelease ko rin siya ng stress kasi busy tayong lahat. Kanina bago yung may nag-uusap dito about parang may problem yata with code or something. Kala ko magpapakita siya ng code. Pero it is a very interesting topic for me. No? It's my favorite hobby to do sa work. But of course, it's much more enjoyable if we do it together. No? So I'll be teaching about the basics of Python. Actually, yung programming in itself, no? Pwede mo siya matutunan sa pagpapanood lang ng YouTube videos. And a lot of information is already accessible out there. But I strongly believe na yung philosophy of programming is better learned kapag may concrete example. Pag may sinasolve kang problem. Medyo boring kapag magbabasa ka ng literature about things like data types, yung how pointer references work, kunwari. Although they're very fundamental, usually the excitement and the motivation to actually learn a complex topic like programming comes from solving a good problem. So hopefully we can identify a good problem and um, try to solve that in this short. I'm not sure how much time I have, pero hopefully mapagkasya natin and we can build something useful. Kaya dun sa agenda kanina, nakita natin it's threefold. No? We appreciate programming, we learn about programming, of course, and the third most important one is we apply whatever we learn. Okay? So with that, I guess we can start. I don't assume, actually, I don't know what to assume. Hindi ako sure kung may mga computers kayo to actually try out the examples, pero I will be sharing some tools that will allow you to write code, and then towards the end we'll actually write code together. Nagagamit tayo ng collaboration tool para makita niyo rin yung work ng mga kasama niyo. Alright, so why learn to code? So coding is one of the most important skills of the modern era. No? Kung mapapansin nyo, coding is actually being integrated sa primary school these days. So hanggang grade school, you have the basic logical thinking, for example. Kasi it's really in demand these days, not only for work, pero if you notice, yung mundo natin ngayon is largely software-driven. Lahat na ng aspeto ng buhay natin is touched by software. Sa Facebook pa lang, social media, applications in industry, sa mga kotse, cars run software these days. No? Whether it be the radio or yung navigation system natin. And of course, you have things like utilities for society. You have Grab, you have Lala Move, all of which are driven by some form of software. So it's a good skill to learn. So for those of you new to programming, I do hope ma-inspire kayo to learn more about it. Whether you use it as a profession or use it something like a hobby. You all need a hobby, and programming is one of the best, I would say, best hobbies that you could use moving forward in the modern world. So one way to motivate yourself as well, no, is to have some idea in mind that you want to materialize, no matter how small that idea is. For example, si Mark Zuckerberg, very popular programmer, creator of Facebook, started out programming by wanting to create a game for his little sister. I'm not sure what game that was. I think something like a variation of tic-tac-toe. Pero sobrang simpleng problem lang siya. He had an objective in mind. He was able to build it, and that's where it sort of started. So hopefully ma-develop natin yung interest in building applications. Mali, not in the Cardano blockchain. Actually, recycle the slide. But it's about building applications basically, and the sky's the limit. You are not restricted to to anything. With programming, you can build almost anything with this. No? Siguro, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, and so let's first understand what programming is in general. No? Paano ba gumagana yung code? Actually, sino ba dito yung baguhan sa programming? Sino ba yung noobs dito? Or baka kasi, I'm not sure, baka yung audience ko is mostly experts na. Sino yung baguhan? Who would say that they're new to programming? I have a couple here. Lahat kayo marunong, mabore lang guys sa lecture ko, sayang naman. Maybe we can go to the more advanced stuff if you want. Okay, so we have a calculator view. Okay, yeah, good. So maybe safe to assume we have audience at least na baguhan dito. So, oh yeah, Andrew's here. Hi, Andrew. So let's first understand first, no? Ano ba yung code and what is software? So technically, software is just something that the computer interprets. Applications are just some things that the computer interprets, and you do know that computers only understand two things, which is a one and a zero. Something I also explained sa previous video. No, I don't know. It's binary, an on and an off. Uh, Now, in order for us to actually code in binary, that would be very difficult. Kasi kailangan natin ng konting mathematical computations. We have to convert base 2 values into something that the computer understands. So just performing a simple calculation, you'll have to create a lot of binary code for that. So to make things easier, we can write code in something that we understand. And this is what is referred to as source code. It's simply a text file that we human beings understand that gets interpreted, either interpreted or compiled by another piece of software that the computer understands. So meron tayong sort of high level abstraction of what binary code is. We use source code so that we know what's going on. Pero meron tayong isa pang software, isa pang layer in our computer, either called a compiler or an interpreter, that converts that code into binary. Now, what's the difference? And this is quite important then so that pag na-encounter nyo to sa work or sa industry, ma-realize nyo yung value nun. What the compiler does is that it literally turns source code into binary, into machine code. So what you get, the product that you get, is the executable, is the binary itself. Kaya kung mapapansin nyo yung mga exe files nyo sa Windows, no? Hindi nyo yan mabubuksan sa text file. Kasi it's all binary. It's all something that only the computer understands. Interpreters, on the other hand, are quite different. Babasahin niya yung code nyo line per line, tapos i-execute niya as binary. Okay, so parang translator, di ba? May nakikipag-usap sa Nihongo, sa Japanese, no? Tapos hindi mo maintindihan, kailangan may mag-translate nun para sa iyo on the fly. Okay, so that's what an interpreter does. Now, what's the difference? Compiler tends to produce faster programs kasi yung product is already something that's binary and fed directly to the computer. Interpreters, on the other hand, they have that overhead kasi line per line siya ini-interpret. So you have that extra layer of abstraction that runs the code in binary. But the point is, at the end of the day, everything is still binary. Performance-wise, that's arguable. That's siguro for a different topic. So that's how code works. Now, yung topic at hand is learning how to code in Python. Now, Python specifically is an interpreted language. Interpreted language. So we write our code later on in a text file, which we call our source code. Tapos, we use another program, which coincidentally is called Python also, that interprets that source code into something that the computer understands. Okay. So siguro next slide for that. So the objectives again is to appreciate programming, learn programming, and then build something eventually. Right, next slide. Okay, and just a short story. So kung fan kayo ng The Matrix is one of the best movies back in the 90s that first captured what computer programming really is. Kasi for those of you who don't know what the story of The Matrix is, you have this simulation called The Matrix, we're actually living in a simulation. Yun yung red pill, blue pill. You know? When you take the red pill, you actually know the truth that you're actually in a simulation. So I'll focus on the Matrix part. There's also a new Matrix movie coming out soon called Matrix Resurrections, as seen by this picture. But basically, yung characters, si Neo, si Trinity, si Morpheus, these are essentially people who understand the code of the Matrix. So if you understand code, you know the rules of the system, you can essentially hack the system. Yung whole idea ng Matrix, kasi sometimes the movie Matrix is being associated with hackers, not because they break something, but because they can understand how the world works. And that's something valuable that we as people sa IT or sa programmers uh, something that we can appreciate. Kasi para sa atin, Facebook is not a black box. Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, we understand how it works and it's all driven by code. Okay? So if you want to be inspired on the whole analogy, romanticized how programming works, panoorin niyo yung Matrix films. It's a very good film. At least yung first movie, hindi ko nagustuhan yung second and third. Hopefully, maging okay yung Resurrections. Okay, so I guess we'll get started in the presentation. So maybe I can share my screen. Uh, ano ba to? Present now. Right, so enough chat. Um, so Python. Python is an interpreted language. We can do almost anything with it, such as general purpose computing. So just to give you an example, no, recently I was working on a machine learning project. Kasi ito yung problem ko. We always start with a problem. Yun yung kailangan natin tandaan. What the problem I had was I had these scans. Excuse me. Okay. These are ano ba tawag dito? Images of I think tumors yata, something like that. And then my objective was I needed to develop hindi naman develop, pero I needed to create an algorithm na given yung mask nila. So ano yung mask? Yung area kung saan mahahanap yung tumor, the program should be able to learn how to detect tumors essentially. Okay? So that was what I was currently working on even bago tong speech na. So the model is actually finished, pero it wasn't finished in time to show the output of it. But the point I'm trying to make is that we start off with a problem and then we use programming to solve that problem. Okay, so let's start off with something simple. um, the problem is we want to learn how to code. We want to tell the computer to do something. Okay, again, I'm trying to frame this as parang assuming lahat tayo hindi marunong mag-code. We'll start off with something and we'll start off with Python. I do understand baka it will take too much time to perform setup. So I've prepared hindi naman I've prepared, pero you can use the simulation of the matrix here in a site called Program is Python Programming Online Compiler. So I'll paste the link sa chat para pwede nyong paglaruan. It basically captures the basics of writing code. In the interface here, you'll have your text editor. Kasi as mentioned, we first have to create source code. Kung ano yung human readable text that we as human beings understand na dapat i-interpret ni Python. So the interpretation comes in the right-hand side. So this is a good way to train the basics of programming using a particular language, which is Python, and go through the entire process, writing source code, interpreting it, and running it in a computer. Okay, so it's a simulation. Katulad nung if you watch the first Matrix, babalikan ko siya lagi. Di ba may simulation program sila where you can test your code out, you can test your um, whatever it is that you create. Okay. So let's try some code out. So just do this thing. Let me just refresh this. If you refresh the site, there's a single line of code here. Now we'll interpret line per line, don't worry. But we can just click on run and it will interpret our code, which is to print out hello world. Okay. Now what's happening here? Again, left-hand side, source code, right-hand side is the result. Ang first two lines dito is actually what you call a comment. And it's one of the easiest things that you can write in code, at least for Python. A comment is represented by a hashtag. Anything to the right of that hashtag is a comment. Comments are basically there for you to document your code. So you can write anything, regardless of syntax. It helps you know what's happening, at least on a source code level. The actual code that is interpreted by Python is here in line number 3. So dito, meron tayong code that says print hello world. This is what we refer to as a function. Paano natin malalaman na function siya? Well, it's easy to detect functions in your code. Functions are basically things na may parentheses. Yun ang tandaan natin for now. Okay? So the name of the function is print. May parentheses siya. Isipin nyo, may container siya. May ilalagay kayo sa container na yun, which is hello world. Now notice also that hello world is enclosed in not curly braces, but double quotations. Okay, this is what we refer to as text, or more formally as a string. So the string, para hindi natin makalimutan, string is a bunch of characters enclosed in double quotes. Okay? Anything inside the double quote is text. Okay? Now, we feed that value. We treat that as a single value. Okay? Values are very important in programming because it's the building blocks. It's data. It's the building blocks of programs. No? It's data that we pass to the function. Okay? Print hello world. Okay? Now, programming is actually rooted a lot in mathematics. So, balikan na, let's try to sort of remember our basic algebra. Sa algebra, we have this thing called a function, f of x, right? Matandaan natin. F of x is what we call a function. And if you see, kamukha niya yung print. F is your function, the same way print is your function. Whatever you pass inside the parentheses is what you call an argument to a function. Namely, we have x. So x is an argument to our function f of x, which will do something. In this case, it will print out text. So that's a very basic concept, but it actually goes a long way. You already know, you now understand that functions simply do something, and we now have a value called a string, which is just a bunch of characters. So yung way of thinking natin when we start learning programming is we need to understand the fundamentals and then apply those, each aspect that we learn. So for example, we know how to print text. What else can we do with it? Well, we can print out our name. Kunwari, you can try it out here as well. You can run. So it does two things, hello world, and then prints out your name. Now, this says something about the nature of Python programming as well. In Python programming, code is read from top to bottom. It starts off with one line, and then the next line, and then the next, and then so on and so forth. Now, there are a lot of paradigms in programming. You have object-oriented, you have functional programming. For now, we'll just deal with procedural programming. Okay? By the way, at any point, kung may questions kayo, then let me know. All right. Okay, so we know how to print stuff. So print lang tayo ng print. Welcome to Skills Brew. Just text. Okay. If you can achieve that, then you're already already better as a programmer. Okay, so I'm trying to limit the talk sa mga basics in order to build something that's actually useful. So what do we know right now? We know how to call a function. We know how to deal with strings. The next fundamental thing that we need to understand in programming is our data. Okay? Data, again, is the building blocks of programs. This is a piece of data. This is another piece of data. This is another piece of data. Okay? Data makes the world go round. Now, in some cases, we don't have these actual values. Okay? We want to represent data as pointers, as references to as containers that we can use all throughout our program. And this is what we refer to as variables. So variables are simply containers of data. And it's something that we declare, we supply. Okay? Ibig sabihin, ikaw magsasabi ko ano yung variable na gagamitin that will hold data. Okay? Now, being a variable, you can name it anything. For example, my nickname actually is Happy. Hindi Raphael. Pero I like to use the formal names, especially sa work. So feel free to call me anything. So here I have a variable called Happy. Okay? And since it holds data, we need to put data inside that variable. So we say equals something. So far, what data type do we know? Well, we know how to create a string. So we can say that this is equated to Raphael Alampay. So which one is the variable here? Si Happy. Yung nasa left-hand side ng equal sign natin. Right? Whatever is to the right of the equal sign is the operation that we put inside the variable. So you can think of programming as reverse mathematics. This is what I always tell my students. No? Reverse mathematics, bakit? Kasi di ba pag nag-ooperate tayo, 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. Right? Ganyan tayo magsulat ng equation, di ba? Yung tinuro sa atin. Asan dito yung operation? Yung operation nasa kaliwa ng equation, 1 plus 1. Yung sagot, dito sa kanan, si 2. Right? Programming baliktad. Yung resulta mo nasa kaliwa, yung yung operation mo nasa kanan. Okay? So, operation ko is to declare a string and then store it to a variable called happy. Now, what can we do with a variable? Well, we know how to call a function, so we can go ahead and print out that variable. I'll say print happy. I'll run this, and what does this do? It prints out hello world, yung name. So these were the two first lines that we typed in earlier. Tapos welcome to Skills Brew. So that's this one right here. And then line number 10 really doesn't have any output. Bakit? Kasi we just told the computer to store a value inside a variable called happy, and then we printed out the value. And now we have the same thing, Raphael Alampay. Okay. Now this can also work for numbers. So let's say we have a variable called sum, or not sum, let's say the product. Okay. A variable called product is equal to 5 times 2. Now we can also perform operations like normal mathematics. No? In this case, you have an operation called multiplication given by the asterisk symbol. You also have plus, which is just a plus sign. You also have divide, which is the division sign, and of course minus, which is the minus sign. Let's try multiplication for product. So, 5 times 2, ano yung sagot? 5 times 2, ano yung sagot? It's 10. Okay? We all aligned sa math natin? Right, so it's 10. Pero let's say hindi natin alam kung ano yung sagot talaga. Well, we can tell the computer to tell us what the answer is by printing the product. Right, so we have hello world, we have the two lines printed out, we print out the value of the variable, and then we print out the variable of product, who happens to have the value of 10 in this case. Okay? All right, let's extend this concept a bit because again, very basic stuff, but there's actually a lot that we can do with it. For example, ayaw natin na 10 lang. Ano ngayon pag 10? Let's say that we want to further this, applying what we know to break down the problem into smaller chunks. We know that we have one number. We know that we have another number. Ayaw naman natin na 5 at 2 lagi natin tinatype. So let's go ahead and store it first in a variable, its own corresponding variable. Let's say num1. We'll assign that to 5, and then num2 will assign that to 2. Now, following the same concept, we can now substitute these values with num1 and num2, and we get the same answer. Okay. What else? Well, we can also perform what's called string concatenation. Let's type it here, string concatenation, wherein you put two or more values together in a string. For example, ayaw lang natin sabihin na 10. Gusto natin magsalita yung computer, sabihin niya the product of num1 and num2 is the product. Right? Gusto natin okay, let's print this out first para makita natin. And I'll remove these other things kasi medyo okay na tayo dyan. Alright, so ano yung result? The product of num1 and num2 is product. Now that doesn't seem correct kasi num1 is a variable, num2 is a variable, product is a variable. Pero bakit literal niya pinrint out to? Kasi nga, it's still a single value. It's a string. Okay? So what we want to do is we want to substitute these. Essentially, we have a long string. And the sort of yung positions na to na nasa loob ng string should be substituted with the variables that we have right here. So how do we do that in Python? Ang daming ways para gawin yun. The most intuitive way I found, well, at least useful for me, I won't go through the other options kasi limited yung time natin, is a bunch of curly braces to represent the different positions. So, open, close curly brace, right? Open, close curly brace, open, close curly brace. Ilan to? One, two, and three. Okay. Now, since we have three pairs of curly braces, we can actually call a function called format. Ano nangyayari dito? Ito yung value natin na string, right? This entire line right here. Um, we use the dot notation to say that we are calling something from that value. Kasi in Python, everything is what we refer to as an object. No? So kung isipin nyo sa movie ng Matrix, lahat ng mga characters dyan may objects. Neo is an object, Trinity is an object, Morpheus is an object. Lahat sila may kakayahan. Kaya ni Neo bumaril, kaya ni Trinity manipa. No? And they also have attributes. Now, objects having attributes and kakayahan, behavior, no, is what we refer to as functions. Print is a function. Format is also a function. That's why we say that format is a behavior of a string. And it does a special thing. Functions do different things. Print prints out something. Format does a different thing. So, what does format do? Well, we need to first make it in the form of a function. Katulad ng ginawa natin sa print, meron siyang parenthesis. And what it does is that depending on the number of curly braces you have in the string that is calling format, we can put in X number of arguments to that function as well. Okay, so parang again in mathematics, this would be something like f of x, y, and z. Whatever x, y, and z are, those are just variables. Ano yung variables natin dito? Num1, num2, and product. So now if we run this, we can see that the computer says the product of 5 and 2 is 10. Right? So, what do we know so far? We know how to call a function. We've called the function directly from an object, which is a string. Okay? I knew this beforehand. I know that we have a format function, but if you want to explore the other functions out there to solve various problems, then you can essentially have to go through the documentation ng Python. Okay? Sige. Question so far. Good naman? Alright. Sige, I think pwede ko i-monitor yung chat dito. Alright. Okay. So, yun. So, we know how to print stuff. We know how to declare stuff. What else can we do? Well, for one, before we move to the next part, let's first analyze these first three lines. Again, yung variable natin is to the left-hand side of the equation. Yung ano natin is to the right-hand side of the equation. The operation is to the right-hand side of the equation, whether it be passing a simple value or performing a mathematical operation. Now, these things will behave according to yung data type niya. So what is a data type? A data type is the type of data ng isang value. For example, 5 is what we refer to as an integer kasi whole number siya. And what can you do with integers? You can add it, you can subtract it, you can multiply. But what happens if you divide an integer? Let's say we divide 5 and 2. Ano kaya sa tingin niyo mangyayari? If we divide 5 and 2, ano mangyayari? What's 5 divided by 2 kapag may calculator tayo? It's quick math. 5 divided by 2 is 2.5. Okay. So, 2.5 is not an integer kasi may decimal place tayo. No? So, in that case, it's a different type of data type which we refer to as a decimal or otherwise known as a float. Right? So, we have an integer which is a whole number. We have a float which is a decimal number. And we have a string. String is also a data type kasi naka-include siya sa double quotations. Okay? So, it really depends on what we pass to a certain variable in order for that data type to actually take shape. Or in order for us to use the variable that has that data type. And the nice thing about Python is that you don't need to declare kung ano yung data type ng variable. Kung ano yung ipasa mo sa kanya, yun yung magiging data type niya. So in this case, num is an integer. Product is also an integer kasi the product of two integers is equal to an integer. Now, we can actually validate that by printing out kung ano yung type ng variable na yun. Just num1, num2, and product. Okay. So we have a new function here called type. Type will tell us kung ano yung data type ng isang variable. Num1, num2, and product. So if you run this, sasabihin niya, num1 is an integer given by int. Num2 is also an integer. Product is also an integer. Okay. If you pass to it a string, sasabihin niya string ito. So let's say my name. Okay, we know it's a string because it's enclosed in double quotations. So when we run this, sasabihin niya integer, integer, integer string. Okay, good. We know how to check kung ano yung data type ng isang variable. And why is this important? This is important because you cannot perform, let's say, addition or division or subtraction with two or more data types that are incompatible. For example, a string is not compatible with a number, like an integer, if you're talking about mathematical operations, because it doesn't make sense to divide a string with an integer. Yeah, so with that, we can now write code from top to bottom, solving various problems. So let's pick a problem. No? Let's say gusto natin, um, let's say we want to work towards building a calculator to determine kung magkano yung investment natin sa cryptocurrency. Ayan. Who here is familiar with Bitcoin, or I think mas familiar yata sa mga tao yung Axie Infinity and all those. Or Bitcoin. Who's familiar with Bitcoin? Now Axie. Okay. Axie. Okay. So Axie Infinity. Magkano ba yung Axie price? Check na natin yung Axie price. Axie right now is $103 per coin. Okay, bagsak tayo ngayon eh. May Ethereum. Okay, let's check out Ethereum. Let's say mag-invest tayo sa Ethereum. Ethereum price. Without writing code yet, wow, 205,000.85. All right. Let's say we want to create a program that tells us how much kumita tayo, no? If we bought Ethereum today versus if we bought Ethereum tomorrow. Or if we bought Ethereum today tas nagbago yung price niya tomorrow, right? Gusto natin malaman kung magkano yung kinita natin. Again, programming always starts with a problem. Right? We know that the current price of Ethereum is this one. Okay? So let me go ahead and copy that. So let's create a program that does just that. So let's write it down first. So create a program that computes the investment if I bought Ethereum today compared to, or today, and how much its value would be tomorrow. So every time we have a problem like this, we need to frame it first sa kung anong gusto nating variables yung pwede mangyari. So I'll start off, let's say we have a variable for the current price, current peso rate of Ethereum, which is now equal to this value. Oops. So how can we implement that in Python? We simply declare a variable and then we pass the value na 205,681.85. What else do we need? We need kung magkano yung current investment natin. Our investment is, let's say, magkano yung willing nyo bilhin na Ethereum dito ngayon? Kung bibili kayong Ethereum, sino mas magandang Ethereum? Si John de Guzman. Ikaw, John, kung bibili kang Ethereum, magkano yung willing mo bayaran? 10 peso. 10 pesos? Let's say 50 pesos lang. Okay, 50 pesos. Right. Now, what's the next problem? Who can tell me kung ano yung equation to um, to tell me how much Ethereum can I buy if I bought today with 50 pesos? What's the formula for that? Anyone? May 50 pesos ako. Ito yung current rate ng Ethereum. How much Ethereum can I get with 50 pesos? How do we solve that? Anyone? Mapua, let's go. Ayan. Okay, so John says something. They divide mo raw. Pero si Juan, tama ba? John, 0.00024. So, I think mas tama si, I'll just say Juan. No? Hindi ko lang ba si Juan. Si Juan de la Cruz. Paano mo na-come up yung 0.000242? Again, we want to implement the logic. No? We want to crack. CoinGecko. Okay, CoinGecko. Pero specifically, ano yung formula for that? May 50 pesos tayo, magkano yung aabutin ng 50 pesos natin sa Ethereum? It's actually, we comment it out here. Whoops. Okay. Ayan. It's actually your investment divided by yung rate. Diba? Kung may 50 pesos ako, ano yung rate niya divided by this one, I get X number of Ethereum. Okay? So let's create a variable for that. We'll say it's my ETH, which is equal to, again, we have two variables here. So pwede natin sabihin investment divided by current PHP rate. Okay, so malapit na yung sagot ni John de Guzman. No? It's the other way around. No? Hindi mo yung rate divided by investment. It's actually investment divided by rate. So this is a good practice because we are trying to think of the solution without thinking of the code yet. We're trying to analyze ano ba yung proseso para i-solve yung problem na to. And once we understand that, the coding part will be, I would like to say straightforward, but it will be easier if we know what we actually need. Okay. So I can now print out that my ETH will be the following. So I'll say format, my ETH, and I should receive something like 0.0002 something. And so if I spent 50 pesos and bought at this rate, okay, now I will get 0.0002 Ethereum out of it. Using Python, we can now perform basic computation. Yan. May suggestion si Gab, we could also create pseudocode. So for those who know what pseudocode is, it's a programming abstraction. So it's just a way to logically define or to define logic logically without necessarily running a specific language. Python is actually very good for pseudocode as well because it's relatively straightforward. You declare values, you have an equation, you print out the answer. Now, this doesn't solve our problem yet kasi yung problem natin is how much would its value be tomorrow. So we are lacking variables in our problem. Yung isang variable would be how much will the rate be tomorrow. Okay? So I need to have another variable. I'll call this variable tomorrow or future PHP rate. Future PHP rate. So yung future PHP rate ko, let's say bumagsak si Ethereum by, I don't know, 1,000 pesos. Okay? So imbis na 205, 204 na siya. Okay. Now, next question is, how can I compute for yung future peso, or yung future peso value ko given future PHP rate? What do you think the answer is? Again, don't think about don't think about code. Think about the solution to the problem. Meron akong 50 pesos, bumili akong Ethereum at this price. I used an equation to compute for that. Paano naman yung next ko? I have the answer, no? My ETH. How can I compute for my current value? So I'll have another variable here, current PHP value. And I want to solve for that. So ano yung equation? Alam ko malulugi ako kasi bumagsak yung presyo eh. Pero how? Okay, may suggestion C1, current minus investment. So paano yun? Current This one, current PHP rate, minus investment. Well, not quite, not quite. Wait, oh yeah. It's actually nakalimutan ko din eh. If I have the current PHP, I want to compute for the current PHP value. Pero, based on magkano, ilang ETH ako meron ngayon, okay? Tapos, magkano yung peso equivalent niya. Parang ganyan yung gusto ko sabihin. So, we know that we eventually have to use yung my ETH, the variable my ETH. And then, we know that this is the future rate. So, ilang ETH ako ngayon, we actually multiply it kung kung magkano yung future PHP rate niya. So, we say my ETH, kung magkano meron ako ngayon, times kung ano yung future PHP rate niya. Okay? Okay, so it doesn't do anything yet. So, let's print it out. So, we'll say current PHP value. After magawa itong computation na to, using the same syntax, we'll say format current PHP value. So, we'll run this. Right? Ayan. So, may sagot na tayo dito, 49 pesos. So, kumita ba tayo or nalugi? Siyempre, nalugi tayo kasi bumagsak yung presyo. Ang original investment natin is 50 pesos. The moment we bought ETH at that price, then ito yung nakuha nating ETH, no? Ethereum price. And then we multiply it to whatever the future rate is. So the goal is dapat magbago yung value ni future rate kung gusto natin kumita. So let's say umakyat siya by, let's say, 3,000 pesos. If we run this again, then our 50 pesos now becomes 50.729. Okay. And then from there, we can then compute kung kumita ba tayo or hindi tayo kumita. And I think dito papasok yung suggestion ni Juan de la Cruz, which is to perform a subtraction. What is our profit? So we can declare another variable. Profit is equal to current PHP value minus kung magkano yung original investment natin. You can print it out. You can see profit is now profit. Siyempre, positive tayo. Right? Positive tayo. Kumita tayo ng 72, 73 cents sa 50 pesos natin kapag tumaas yung rate ni Ethereum to 208,000 pesos. Okay. Let's say bumagsak siya, 201. If you run this again, ibig sabihin, nalugi tayo by how much? By almost 1 peso. Pag bumagsak yung presyo ni Ethereum. So the point of this is that with Python, you can easily create very simple computations to solve certain problems, such as computing your current portfolio based on some current rate. Now, medyo maikli lang tong lecture na to, no? Because Python goes a long way for it. The next thing that I'd like to achieve yung third objective, which is to build something. Okay, so we understand what programming is. We learned a little bit of programming. You can use this tool to, compute stuff using Python without having to install Python. You know how to print stuff on screen. And now let's apply it to a much grander application. Now, we'll talk a little bit about some advanced stuff here. No? Pero, you can sort of break it down into smaller problems and then analyze it later on. Specifically, the problem I'd like to solve is, ang pangit naman na puro i-encode natin yung value dito sa code natin, tapos saka natin i-hit yung run. Wouldn't it be better if we actually fetch it from source? No? Kumbaga, we want to integrate, and this is where Python is especially good at. No? We want to integrate our program with a service out there that already gives us what we want. And what do we want? We want the value of ETH. Okay? Now, I'll share a link over at chat, which is what we call an API. An API is a short for application programming interface, and essentially it's It can mean a lot of things, pero in the web, in the internet, an API often translates to a URL, an endpoint, that will give you some data. So here's an example of an API. It's a free API from CoinGecko, which gives you the value of a certain cryptocurrency. I'll explain what this data is later on. But since Ethereum hinahanap natin, I think we need to put out Ethereum. There you go. So I'll copy this link. Feel free to open this link up sa browser. All right. So pag binuksan nyo yun sa browser, you'll receive this data. Now, the reason why I have this data formatted this way kasi yung browser ko uses an extension that formats whatever this text is into something that's more understandable. Pero makamamaya kasi pag view nyo sa browser, parang biglang puro data lang siya. So let's understand what this data is. This data is what we refer to as a JSON object. Okay? Now, the term might seem creepy, pero really we can also model it in Python. A JSON object starts off with a set of curly braces. It's simply data that is structured in a specific way. Okay, so for example, I'll create a variable here called data. Sige, burahin ko na to na para clean slate tayo. I'll create a variable here called, sige, ako ko burahin. Maybe you can copy paste this and try to run it. And very simple program, copy paste it dito sa interpreter, play around with it, and see what different values you can get. So I'll start off with a clean slate with data. Now, an object or JSON object, in Python we call this a dictionary, or it can be modeled using a dictionary, starts off with a bunch of curly braces. So ito, zoom in ko na dito ngayon. Now, inside that curly braces, you can structure data based on what's called a key value pair. Okay? So, ano yung key value pair? A key value pair, sorry. Okay. A key value pair starts off with a key that is in double quotes. It's a string. No? Now, the key represents what you call an attribute. It's a description of whatever this object is. Yung curly brace. So for example, let's say data is structured with an attribute called price with a value called 500.00. We can structure it this way. You have a key and you have a value, which is a float number, a decimal number. Now, how do we access that structure? Well, we can access it by using the variable data. But we don't simply say print data. Instead, we say print data, and then we pass to it, okay, zoom in ko lang, we pass to it a set of brackets, ito, and then pass to it the name of the key, in this case, price. Now, if you run this, ang lalabas dito would be 500. So what we expected, kasi yung value is 500. You could also structure data using dictionaries. Again, this is a dictionary. Okay? You could also structure data using a dictionary using different keys or several keys inside the object. So now we have price, and then let's say we have, let's say coin type, coin underscore type. Ang value niya is a string this time around. Bakit na natin alam na ito yung value? Kasi may colon tayo dito. It's also separated by a comma. In fact, some programmers would like to write it this way. Okay, para mas readable siya. You have like an opening curly brace here, closing curly brace for that object. You have an attribute price, you have the value 500, and then you have another attribute here, again separated by comma, and then you have the coin type ETH. Just some value. So now that we have that, we'll now type in data, same thing, coin type, to get the value of whatever is attached to that attribute. So in this case, coin type, relative to data. So yung variable pa rin natin si data, and data will hold a complex set of values inside the curly brace. So what we get is 500 and ETH. Okay, now, why is this important? Because such a structure is the medium that's being used by modern applications today to allow you to integrate information with it. So doon kanina sa link, so let me paste this link for Ethereum that will give you data about Ethereum from CoinGecko, will be in that same format. So if you notice, kapag nag-zoom ako dito, it follows the same format. May opening curly brace tayo, and then may key tayo. Although specifically for JSON kasi, it doesn't use quotes sa keys niya. So it's just something like ID and then colon. So this is something that we also did sa code natin. And then you have the value at the right-hand side, comma, tapos attribute, colon, value ulit. Right? And all sorts of data here. Even complex data such as the following. Meron tayong key called platforms, tapos may curly brace siya. So ibig sabihin, yung value ng object ng platforms will be another object na may kanya-kanyang key, may kanya-kanyang value, etc. And this is where it gets complex because as a programmer, as a person who's part of the matrix, we need to understand what this structure means so that we can hack it. We can essentially, when I say hack, I mean we want to bend it to our own needs. No? And this data, if we go through it, baka medyo malabo sa inyo sa browser, no? Pero eventually we'll reach a piece of data that, ayan, market data whose value is a set of curly brace. So, ibig sabihin, object uli siya or dictionary uli siya. Tapos may sarili siyang key na current price whose value is curly brace. Okay? And then meron siyang mga iba't ibang rate ng price. And what are we looking for? We're looking for the price of Ethereum for PHP. And we have it right here, 205661. Okay, now how do we hack this? How do we interpret this? So let's just imagine, no? Ano ko siya side by side dito. Okay, let's assume that data is equal to that complex object. So let's use our imagination. Kunwari itong data na to, itong malaking to. If I wanted to get the rate, okay, of again, going back to our original program yung kanina, if I wanted to get the current PHP rate ng Ethereum, and how do I extract it from data? We'll have to traverse yung keys niya. Saan ba natin nakita yung PHP price na hinahanap natin? From the top of our object, we have to go to a key called market data. So how do we type that? Using our bracket from the example earlier, right? Just to refresh our memories, price, ganyan. So in our case, that would be data, double quotes, market underscore data. Tapos ano yung value ni market data? If you take a look at this structure, well, yung value niya is another object. So it means itong part na to, okay, ang value ng data, bracket market data, is actually another object. Now we know how to traverse the object because an object is just comprised of keys, such as current price. So pwede natin ituloy-tuloy. We can say current price. Okay, let me zoom out a bit. Pag in-expand natin itong current price, kaya useful yung tool, no? Try nyo download yung tinatawag na JSON view, browser plugin extension, para lumabas yung JSON data in this format, para mas madali nyo ma-traverse yung data. And then now we have PHP. So may PHP dito. PHP, okay, which is also a key. So it means na we have PHP right here. Okay. So we know we can get the current PHP rate using this value. What else do we need? We need investment. And let's say we invested 50 pesos again to the current PHP price. And then we use the same formulas that we had. My ETH right now is equal to investment divided by the current PHP rate. Right? Para makuha natin yung current my ETH natin dito. So let's go ahead and print this. We'll say my ETH equal to my, so format natin dito, my ETH. Okay? And then, ano yung isang problem natin? Gusto natin na makita yung rate of change niya. So every time we ask data from this endpoint, magbabago tong value. Let's try to refresh this. No? If I refresh this, okay, it will give me a fresh new fetch of data. And let's try to see um, kung ano yung value ni ETH na yan. Let's see. Okay, market data. We have PHP, so we're doing this manually right now. Nakalimutan ko kung ano yung original value, pero I'm pretty sure nagbago siya, I think. Medyo 70% sure ako na nagbago siya. So 205,509. So let's analyze the problem. It means na I want to consistently fetch this data. Right? I want to consistently fetch this data habang and then compute at every fetch ng data. I want to compute how much my current investment is. We already know the formula for that. At some point, we need to compute for the future rate, which is equal to something. Hindi pa natin alam kung ano yung something na yun. And then the formula for that is yung current peso value is equal to the future rate. What did we say about this? Yung ETH natin times the future rate. How much ETH we have multiplied by the future rate. But we don't know how to do that yet. No? We know how to compute for it, but how do we set the future rate? Ibig sabihin, at some point, we need to call this again. We need to update data para makuha yung peso value in this same structure from this endpoint. And this is where Python is actually very useful. It allows you to integrate your code with other existing systems. Okay? We're actually lacking time here, so I'll go ahead and use this code. Now, one thing you can also do to practice Python is to go to this thing called Google Colab. Okay, I share the link here. Okay, so you can access the code. The reason why I'm using Google Colab, it's a free service now. So kung may Gmail kayo, you can go ahead and create what's called a Colab notebook, which is basically a Python notebook where you add code in, where you can test code for free in using Python. I won't explain much of the details here, although we can have another chat next time about this. But kung gusto nyo tignan yung code for this, you can feel free to check out that notebook. We can code at the same time here. Actually, I had a plan na parang baka may gustong mag-code live. We can use this for that as well. And I have the code for getting the data itself. Okay? So, let's try to run this. No? Ano ba nangyayari dito sa code na to? Well, let me just change this to Ethereum. It runs a bunch of Python code. We don't necessarily need to know, at least for now, no, kung anong ginagawa, anong ibig sabihin nito. But briefly, this will just import what are called dependencies in Python, such as URL lib request, which is an object that allows us to make calls sa mga URLs. So ito yung URL natin. We know that it is a string. We know that this is just some function. And we have some weird syntax here na parang with this function, as the result for URL, we'll call another function called json.loads, url.read, decode def, which at the end of the day will give us data. That's why when we say here, print data, it gives us that same format that we need. Okay. So nakukuha na pala natin si data. So what's left here? Let's use our traversal here. Now we know that we can get PHP value by calling this structure. So if I hit play here, makikita natin, whoops. Bytes as no code attribute decode def. Bakit? I think hindi yata ito yung original code. It might have yeah, hindi ito yung original code. Ano nangyari? Nalagay ko yung F yata. Okay, there we go. Okay, nalagay ko lang yung F. So anyway, let's bring back PHP here. And we get that value. So every time you run this, nag-integrate na siya sa ibang system to get the value of ETH here. And now we can incorporate our code. So let's say ito yung stuff natin. It says read line per line. Inilipat ko lang dito. Okay, again, this is free. Feel free to check it out. We have our input for investment. We can now compute our investment over current PHP rate. Pero ano ba yung current PHP rate natin? It's simply this one. Remove this price here, and let's just see if we have the correct answer. Does it print my ETH, format my ETH? Okay, so we still get that 0.002 something. Okay, so good. We have my ETH. Now, what about yung isa nating problem wherein we want to keep on getting this data and then compute for our current PHP value? Well, that can actually be achieved by what we call in programming as a loop. The easiest way to perform a loop is to have a condition that should return true or false. As long as that condition is true, it will continuously perform whatever that thing is. Now, in Python, we can easily do that by calling this command called while. And then for now, let's just pass through to it. So the true here is what we call a Boolean value. A Boolean value can either be two values, either true or false. So when we say something that while true, forever true siya, okay, it will never be false. It's as if we're saying we have an endless loop, okay, infinity. It will continue to do something as long as something is true. Well, this is always true. True is always true. So it will do whatever it is that is indented from this while statement. Okay, so may concept tayo sa Python na indentation, wherein if we indent something, it's as if we're saying, do that something relative to the upper statement. And what is that something? That something will be our code right here. Well, actually, this code right here, we can copy paste this here as if we are saying, habang umiikot tayo sa loop, keep on getting data. Okay, which will give us our, I'll just call this rate para mas simple. And then we can compute for our peso value. So our peso value will be rate times my ETH, which we already have right here. Whatever that value is, it will allow us to determine if we profit or not. And we already know that equation. We'll say profit is equal to our investment minus, or rather, our peso value. Umpisa natin sa peso value. Profit is equal to the peso value minus our initial investment. And then we can print out our profit. Same code that we had earlier. So if we read this from top to bottom, this is something quite understandable in terms of Python. We get data from some other service, in this case, yung API for getting the value of Ethereum. We analyze kung ano yung binabalik na data ni Ethereum. So in this case, yung PHP value. Okay? We analyzed it and then we traversed that object by getting the PHP value. And then we have our initial investment, the 50 pesos. Of course, you can make this variable. If, let's say, you decide to spend 500,000 pesos right now, okay, dun sa current value niya, we compute how much ETH we can actually buy with 500,000 pesos. Okay? We enter a loop here, which we call while true, and do the exact same thing. Actually, may kulang dito eh. Yeah, I think this will do. So, paulit-ulit siyang gagawin until we force stop it. So, let's see if this works. I'll play this code. Yan. Okay. So now, it's continuously looping. Okay. And then at every point, let's just stop this here. Okay, mag-error siya kasi it won't allow us to keep on looping for that. But the point here is that now it will keep on fetching data. We now have a Python program that easily fetches data from some third party. And then it can now compute our profit or loss, okay, given yung mga variables na dineclare natin. Okay? So, ang point ko lang dito, I know that I skipped a lot of things in terms of what does this mean, what does this while loop actually means. But at the very least, we have a basic understanding of how code works. Using Python, we can easily declare variables, right? Assign values to these variables, and everything else around it It's basically building on top of it. Ang importante dito, we know what our problem is and how we want to achieve it. So a good way to practice programming is to actually um, think of a problem first and then think of the solution, even without writing code yet. So the code part can be solved at a later time. Okay. So let's just see if this one runs again. Kanina may lumalabas na nakita natin. Ayan. Uh, Eventually, Google will stop this. Pero the reason why profit natin is zero is because hindi pa nagagalaw yung price. Pero once gumalaw yung price, no, makikita natin mag-iiba yung profit value natin. And it's actually automated because now you are not hard coding values except for investment. Pero nagfe-fetch kang values to another API. Okay? Ayan. So, hopefully this one will inspire you to start working on or start exploring programming. This is very basic in terms of just declaring variables. Actually, you can just start playing around with it. I shared the link here. I'll try to complete this entire program para makita nyo yung full version of it. I think we need to remove the while loop here, or at the very least loop X number of times. Pero if you run this on your own, so let's say I run this in my computer. Okay, ganun na lang. Okay, so now I'm in my computer. I'll go ahead and create a file that contains that code. Let's say investment.py. Okay, so if you're starting to write code in Python sa sarili ng computer, you save it as a file called .py. This is a text file. You can use your favorite text editor to write code in it. And then you paste your code there. So using pala yung format nito kasi ano siya pag copy-paste. So the entire code looks something like this. We have our investment, we have our computation, we have our print. This is our while loop. Okay, this is the same rate. We have our value here. That's our code. Okay. Let's try to run this. We feed it to our interpreter. So depending on how you installed Python, Python 3 in my case is the interpreter inside my computer, and I feed it the source code that we just created. Then maglo-loop na siya. So now it's actually computing profit by fetching data from a third-party system. And then I can actually leave this alone and then see kung magpo-profit ako or hindi based on the equation. Right? And Control C to stop. And then that's it for basic Python programming. Actually, 1 hour can't really encompass everything in Python, pero hopefully you learned something and hopefully it inspired you to start learning programming because you can do all sorts of things with programming. Hindi lang to. This is very simple, but it does solve a problem. We can now compute magkano kikitain natin if we bought Ethereum today. Yeah. Right, yun lang for now.
Magki-crypto na yung mga yan, Raf.
Imaginary lang naman. Imaginary, kunwari lang may 500,000. Pero wala tayong 500,000. Okay. Right. So, ayan. That's it for me. Thanks for listening. Bili na rin ng minery. Okay, baka may questions kayo about programming in general. Like, what can it do? Ano bang... Any questions?
Ako, Raf, meron.
Yeah, sure.
I can remember on the first time na set up ako ng Python, sa tingin ko, ito yung pinakamatagal kong setup ng workspace sa lahat. So, nakapag-setup na ako ng ano ng programming language. Pero yung Python, yung pinakanahirapan ako. One thing I forgot is i-document yung what worked for me. So, I think, gumamit ako ng Pip Essentials nun eh. Tapos eventually, I gave up. Tapos gumawa rin ako ng Docker environment. I gave up din.
Medyo komplikado na pag Docker.
Oo. So, I forgot kung ano yung ginawa ko. Pero, related doon. So, I think may encounter din nila yung the same problem. So, baka mayroon kang tips and tricks on how to properly set up your Python environment.
Alright. So, actually, it's largely dependent on your operating system. Pero, I follow a specific type of... So sige, dun sa pinaka-simpleng setup. Now, if you want to set up Python in your computer, the simplest way to set that up is via yung main installers. No? So um, Python.org. Python.org. So you can check out the main website of Python. Now, when you install Python, it's uh, it's relatively straightforward, but the ideal setup, kasi ang tanong mo, Gab, no, parang what would be a good setup for Python, standard way that we can follow? Once you install Python, at least for Python 3, it has this thing called virtual environments. Okay, so what is a virtual environment? A virtual environment is a way to uh, it's a way to compartmentalize or create an environment specific for a Python version. So parang nangyayari diyan, nag-install ka lang ng Python para gamitin yung paggawa ng environment na may isolated Python. No? And why do you want this? Kasi minsan sa mga projects, you might be using Python 3.5, kunwari. Tapos sa ibang project mo, Python 3.9. No? Minsan ganun yung requirement eh. May mga discrepancies for it. So, the easiest way is to create an individual Python environment per project para independent siya. And how do we do that? We first go to the download sections ng Python. And the nice thing about this is that it has different Python installations for different operating systems. So for example, usually madali na siya these days. So you just install it. But again, you won't use that Python to actually write code. I'll walk you through the process. So, for example, sa computer natin, we start off with a project. We call this, create a directory here. I'll call it my project. Okay, so it's just a folder inside our computer. Now, once you have Python installed, there's this command called Python, using Python 3 in this case, mvn or -m vn, which stands for virtual environment. And then the next argument to that is to pass a name of a directory, usually env to, but really it can be anything. I'll call it env kasi yun yung nakasanayan ko. And what it will do for you is that it will create a folder called env doon sa loob ng folder natin na may project. And the reason why we want to do that is we want to source it. So there's this command to source. In Windows, it's a little bit different, but the argument is the same thing. We need to run a script called activate na gagawin ni Python para sa project na to. Okay, so this one is included every time we initialize an environment. Well, when I type this, ang nangyayari dyan is that Python will actually treat yung Python na naka-install dito sa folder na to as the Python for that project. Okay, so now if I install a library, let's say OpenCV2 or OpenCV Python, lahat ng calls dito will be isolated just for that project. Okay, so what does it look like sa computer? So it's basically this one. My project. So this is my Python project. Tapos may virtual environment ako dito. Lahat ng Python-related stuff ko, dito nag-i-install. Because usually, the reason why projects crash, no, or programs hindi na sa setup ng tama, is because napaghahalo-halo na siya. Di ba? You try a lot of things in Python, you install several libraries, tapos minsan nagkakot na, di ba?
Exactly.
So doon usually nangyayari yung mga ano. So with virtual environments, at least starting Python 3, you can have an isolated environment per project. Of course, medyo hassle siya kasi parang bawat try mo gagawa kang directory, gagawa kang virtual end, but it's actually good practice. Kasi it allows you to isolate a project sa computer nyo and use that Python version. And you can have multiple Python versions per project. Para pag nag-install kayong library, dun lang. Pag di nyo siya kailangan, delete nyo yung folder. It's much easier that way. Yeah, so simple yung process lang. Install Python, create an environment, activate it, and you're good to go. So,
Nice. Okay.
Alright.
see, other
Thanks,
questions?
Rob.
Yeah, may other questions pa kayo? No, very insightful talaga yung ano natin today. Kasi I've mostly been doing calculator stuff, pero ayan, parang mas clear na sa akin actually kung paano gumana yung APIs in that way. Pero mostly
Yeah.
kapag naririnig ko APIs about sa Google Maps yun, iniisip ko eh. Yeah,
Well,
yung
it
mga
can mean
tracking.
anything, no? Pwedeng,
Yeah.
basta pag API, it gives you, parang nag-expose siyang functionality ng isang system. So, sa sinabi mo na Google Maps API, ibig sabihin may functionality si Google Map na pwede mong i-integrate sa system mo and, do all sorts of things with Google.
Ayan, nice. So, ayan, my question to from our audience. Is Python used to make games?
Okay, so 'di ba nakita niyo yung structure yung diagram kanina? We had a compiler and we had an interpreter, 'di ba? So sa diagram na yun, we said that Python is an interpreted language. So it's much slower than compiled languages. Kaya nangyayari diyan, although Python can be used to make games, it isn't as optimized as a compiled language. Kaya usually yung games na ginagawa natin ngayon is based on C, C++, kasi these are compiled languages. But you could make games in Python. In fact, there's a framework called Pygame. You can make 2D games out of it. It's a good way to learn games programming. So you can check that out and create your own 2D game. Pero maganda rin kasi sa Python is that you can compile it to binary. And this is a double-edged sword. Bakit? Kasi fine, you can write your game in Pygames, yung shinare kong link kanina. But and then compile it to binary para mabilis. However, that also opens up opportunities for people who write viruses. Kasi dati, mahirap magsulat ng virus. Alam mo yung ransomware, yung mga parang ilalock yung computer mo unless magbayad ka ng Bitcoin. That's actually very difficult to write in a low-level language, in a compiled language. But since you can actually take Python and compile it to binary, I think there's a compiler. If you just search Python to binary, you'll be to executable pala. Executable. There's this library called ayan, hindi siya PyInstaller. Keep forgetting what it is. Basta there's a way to let's take a look at sa Py2exe or PyInstaller. No? There's a way to convert your Python code directly into binary. Now, it means na a high-level language such as Python, katulad ng ginawa natin sa kanina, with just a few lines of code, nakakapag-fetch tayo ng API. You can write a virus in Python, compile it to binary para ma-bypass yung Python interpreter. So it's actually a very dangerous thing. Pero going back to your question, short answer, yes. Pwede ka gumawa ng games in Python. In fact, yung Blender, for those of you familiar with Blender, yung 3D model.
Blender daw!
So it does provide a good API interface for Python. You actually write your scripting ng animation in Python. Of course, may mga tools for that. But if you really want to get to the yung parang pinakabituka ng Blender, you can write various plugins in Python. Dami applications. Yeah. Pero primary scripting language ni Blender, Python. Alam ko may game engine din si Blender. You can create games in there. So feel free to explore.
Ayan, that's very nice. So, may questions pa tayo, guys. Just drop it in the comment section. Ay, open mic lang.
Yeah, pwede yung gamitin yung mic.
Yep. But actually, question lang yung kanina. Since naglo-loop siya, right? Pwede siyang palitan yung intervals of looping. Kasi parang napansin ko isang buong biglang isang buong line of the same thing. Though,
Hindi,
I think,
kasi malit yung change mo, diba? Parang sa next iteration mo, hindi naman nagbago yung price. So, same value yung lumalabas.
There's a way na parang siguro madedetect na lang niya yung change. And then dun lang niya ipiprint or something.
Yeah, so that's an example of thinking of a solution first, diba? Now yung solution mo is to detect the change. So from there, you can declare yung variables. For example, previous amount, current amount. Pag minus mo siya and then zero siya, then walang change. So you don't print out anything. Something like that. So may facility. So programming, that's easily done using if-else statements. No? if the difference is equal to 0, then wala kang gagawin. Or the opposite, if it's not equal to 0, then saka may print yung profit or loss. Para lang ma-detect mo yung change.
Nice.
Pero tuloy-tuloy lang siya.
So parang naisip ko, if kung ganun, may mga parang you would have to keep your machine up all night just checking. So
Yeah.
that's why they have servers for that, no?
And yeah, you probably would run it sa server, tapos ang dami mo pa i-extend dun eh. Parang if you hit a certain price, let's say yung profit mo makyat to 100 pesos, you write a simple Python script. May mga one-liners that will email you. Parang send an email na, uy, benta mo na yung Ethereum mo kasi ano siya sa 100. So now you have an automated bot na parang, okay, alam ko kailan ako magbebenta. Pag na-reach tong threshold na to.
Yeah. Actually, yan yung next stage ng DeFi na medyo, may nag-ano na sa amin dyan eh. May nagtanong. And if you want to know more about that dun sa concept na sasabi ni Raph, it's called AMM, Automated Market Maker.
Market Maker, yeah.
Yeah, so ayun siya, may sarili siyang buhay. So magbebenta siya, bibili siya. So, kayo na rin yung gumagawa ng market. So dahil sa ganung ano.
It drives the price value of a certain asset. Eh. So I actually have one running right now sa sa isang exchange. So
nice.
hindi siya pangkita no, pero it's just a way to measure yung I don't do it for profit. I just want to determine the volatility of a certain asset kasi interesting siya eh. Na concept.
Ito yung sa may mga swap eh. Mga pancake swap.
Decentralized exchanges, yes.
Nice. Galing.
DeFi is the future.
Alright guys, may questions pa kayo before we move on to closing? Earn tips or baka gusto nyo i-share kung ano ginagamit yung programs. I think the first one I tried it on was VS Code. It's here right now. Though alam ko madami talagang ano dyan eh. Gulat ko pagbukas ko ng VS Code, ang daming languages, pwede mo palang ano.
Yeah, VS Code is just considered an IDE from Microsoft. So it does a lot of things. It can detect Python by default. Marami ring plugins available. Usually VS Code na yung go-to tool ngayon ng those beginning in programming and those who are already seasoned programmers. So it's basically just a tool. Whether you can write Python in any tool. Basta nakaka-save siya ng Python files. Text file lang naman siya.
Yeah.
Right. Other questions? Kahit din medyo outworldly questions.
Alright. I think wala na ata silang questions. I guess we can close na. Pero next time siguro magkaroon ulit tayo ng maganda nga magkaroon ng live coding session dito eh.
Yeah. Actually I'm open to those types of things basta may time. Kahit over drinks, I have coffee here.
Nice JM. Alam mo na JM.
Kasi ginagawa ko rin na record ko siya tapos pinapost ko rin sa YouTube kaya magandang ano siya. I have some recordings sa YouTube. Check it out there.
Kailangan ma-invite yung iba.
Yeah, sige. Hanap tayong pagkakataon. Alright, so since wala na tayong questions, move na tayo sa closing slides natin. Ayan. So baka may gusto ka dyang i-plug na other Raph, pero here just to share, check out your Cloudband solutions, and then my YouTube rin, and then my Git. So yun. Yep. And then next is ayun, again I just want to reiterate, madami kaming social media, so hanapin niyo lang kami sa FB, LinkedIn, IG, and then just drop your DMs, magkulit lang kayo dyan. Madami pa kaming content and sessions that is going to be similar to this one. And then next, we're open to internships. So baka may kakilala kayo dyan, mahilig mag 4 things, digital marketing, content creation, digital design, graphic design pala, and of course, coding. Kunin nyo lang, recommend nyo lang sa amin. Very fun dito. And then of course our WSBs we're gonna be continuing. Every week naman siya pero most of the time we do remind if ever may changes in schedules now that. And community events. Most of our community events you can find on our Facebook group Work Connections PH. Work Connections PH type ko na lang dito. Then makikita nyo naman yan eh. There we go. All right. So, lastly, again, thank you guys for joining our WSB. Ito yung social media links ulit namin. Hoping to see you guys next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raph. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you next
Bye-bye.
time. Bye.
Bye-bye.